Hey, all, this is John. Talking to you through the about the Airthread case. Airthread's kind of a basic valuation case. I use it as a way to kind of go back through and remind students of you know issues that are in valuation. So it tends to be not a overly difficult case, if you will. What I would say is we're going to use, I make them do a few things that they probably haven't done before, but for the most part, it's a pretty straightforward case. So I would expect them to do pretty well. And again, let's just make sure they're doing some decent analysis. Some things are kind of difficult. I kind of like to hold it against students because I just want them to try it. And I want to move away from it being all about the right answer. So if I go to there's my valuation and then my Airthread valuation. I've got sort of a CAPES synopsis. Essentially what's going on here is we're doing an acquisition of ACC is evaluating Airthread as a potential acquisition. It's going to allow them to sort of potentially gain access to wireless technology and spectrum. You want to have to bundle services. Essentially ACC's got everything but wireless, so they want to add Airthread to allow them to offer a bundle of services that would be sort of landline, wireless, internet, etc. This is in a world 10 years ago where that was kind of becoming a big deal. So they're going to evaluate these guys as a potential acquisition. Now, the one thing to keep in mind here is that we are actually going to sidestep a lot of the acquisition issues for this case. I think Dick might do it this way, but what I tend to do is I do a basic WAC valuation on Airthread. Then what I do is after I do the case review based on a as-is WAC-based DCF valuation, I come back and then I look at it as an APV valuation to sort of introduce the idea that you could do an APV valuation. And just a sort of a way to think about what we're trying to accomplish. So keep that in mind as you go through this. I'm sort of thinking about using this case as the way to set up a WAC-based valuation, doing a WAC-based valuation, ultimately do APV. You won't have to deal with that in your grading, but I'm just giving you that sense. So first thing that we do here is I sort of walk them through, they have to do all this. Of course, you'll see that in my spreadsheet. I have them do a WAC based on this, so you can use this. Now, they have to unlever the WAC to 0.82 based on the individual companies. So you'll see here they use this asset beta formula in my spreadsheet. And then they have to relever, which is relevered based on the debt to equity of the industry, which we're using as, we're choosing to treat these comparable companies as the industry. Now, the thing to keep in mind here is essentially we're unlevering and then we're relevering with the same numbers. So we end up back at about the average equity beta. It's kind of just coincidental because we use the target as the industry average. So, but there should be some sort of attempt on their part to unlever and relever based on that. Now, once you get this beta, equity beta, levered beta, then you come back here and throw it into the CAPM formula. Sorry, I don't have the CAPM formula. I'll just show it right here. This is my CAPM formula. Essentially, 101 times 5% plus the 4.25 would give me that equity beta. And then that's the cost of debt times the 1 minus t gives me that after-tax cost of debt. And then I just weight it so I get, 762 after I add the two sort of pieces of the weighted average cost of capital formula. So I'll use that as my weighted average cost of capital. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use sort of the information. This is from Exhibit 1 in the case. So let me see here. I'll show you this should be Exhibit 1 in the case. They get this information. Now, you're going to notice, I don't think there should be that much difference, frankly, for this part of the valuation. I mean, in other words, these are all pretty much given by Exhibit 1, so I wouldn't think there'd be that much difference. You may find the change in net working capital a little bit different. I still would think that they'd be within especially in these years, between 10 and 40 million changes each year. There is my basis for coming up with laying out the cash flows or laying out the different working capitals. I would argue, or I kind of feel like the working capital is sort of I don't like the way that they sort of present these ratios. Part of what they're doing is they're using times, for example, when they actually mean days and things like that. So I'm a little bit, I sent them out a note to sort of say, here's how to think about these. But as long as the working capital seems reasonable, I think, let's just go with it. I don't want to get too worried about, whether they were exactly right or whatever it might be. Now, CapEx again was given. So really, we shouldn't be that different on the free cash flows. Again, they might be different because of net operating working capital. As long as it looks like what they did was reasonable, let's not get too worked up about that. So the first thing that they need to do is they need to come up with the long-term growth rate. And by the way, let me just back up for a second. Part of what we're expecting here is that they're going to be describing their methodology, right, for the assumptions. So as long as they're doing a decent job of that, let's go with it. Ultimately, they're going to have to get the value of Airthread from all this, but I would say one is pretty much describing what they did in those processes. Then they have the terminal value, which is going to be based on a growth rate, which I found to be 2.58. Now, if you look at my growth rate, what I'm sort of forcing the issue on is I'm making them think about, usually we just take, some growth rate, 3%, or it's 1% or 2%. I actually want them to sort of come up with a fundamental reason for why the growth rate is what it is. So what I'm saying here is that I'm saying here's an approach that we could use to the growth rate. Frankly, I'm fine with several approaches. I just want them to do something to kind of come up with a growth rate. So I sort of tried to talk about this where I said, okay, so let's pretend that I use my invested capital on the balance sheet, which for the most part is going to be PP&E plus intangible assets less, long-term non-financing liabilities plus any long-term assets that are non-investing type assets. So money that's invested net of liabilities that is designed to generate the free cash flows. And that comes out to be $4.6 billion in this particular case. And then what I do is I say, okay, so that's where I'm at as of 07. So now let's go forward and let's kind of roll forward the various investments. So this is right from the case assumptions, right? And I would like to roll forward maybe intangibles, other things. I just don't have visibility to that. So what I do is I roll forward the working capital and then the net of the capital expenditures. And ultimately, I sort of show the change in invested capital, which sort of grows or declines initially, then it grows. And there's my invested capital as of 2012. And then I'm sort of showing how much is being reinvested in the business based on these three things. Now, look, they don't have to necessarily do it this way, but it would be nice to see something. Because ultimately what I'm saying is, look, your growth rate really ought to be a function of two things. The percent of NOPAT that you reinvest. So in this case, my NOPAT in 2012 was 434. They invested 120 over 434, or about a quarter to 27, 28% of that. Then I say, well, what kind of return did you make on your NOPAT? So the 2012 return based on the 2011 NOPAT would give me a return on invested capital of about 9.3%. And then ultimately, that would lead to like a 2.5% estimated growth rate. Now, look, they don't have to do exactly this. They could have used, 2007, 2008, although that gets tricky because these are negative. They could use an average. One group that presented even used a historical. Any of that I'm fine with. But I want them to think about that, hey, how much is reinvested relative to what were the returns for that reinvestment should drive a growth rate. And so I want to be very flexible on this. But I would like to see some sort of fundamental attempt to figure out a growth rate. If they didn't make any attempt, then I say we take a half point off. But for the most part, I think that's something I definitely wanted them to think about in this case. I will come back and continue and finish up the case review.